The date is September 6th, 1944, a day that would forever alter the lives of those involved. In a dusty, makeshift prison camp on the outskirts of Manila, the tropical heat presses down on the prisoners, stifling and oppressive. The hum of cicadas fills the air, a constant, shrill reminder of the ceaseless passage of time. The camp, surrounded by high barbed wire fences and guard towers, sits in a tense silence as the daily rituals of the prisoners' lives unfold. Food is scarce, the conditions are brutal, and the ever-watchful Japanese guards keep a steely eye on those under their charge. In the midst of this, a group of Japanese women prisoners, captured during a recent Allied raid on the Philippines, stand in the yard of the camp. These women, dressed in the simple, tattered clothing that prisoners often wear, appear weary and broken, shadows of their former selves. They were soldiers in the Imperial Japanese Army, conscripted into the service of a war machine that had conquered much of the Pacific. Now, they are prisoners of war, with no clear future, held captive by the very people they once sought to defeat. As the prisoners gather in the yard, the mood shifts with the arrival of the American guards. The camp has recently been captured, and now, under new leadership, the women face an unsettling directive. The order is delivered coldly: undress. The air becomes thick with confusion and fear. The women, once soldiers themselves, trained in discipline and control, now face a humiliating order that defies everything they were taught to believe about honor, power, and the rules of war. This moment, steeped in raw emotion and uncertainty, is the catalyst for a shocking turn of events that would not only shape the future of these women but also alter the trajectory of how prisoners of war were treated in the Pacific theater. The women's reactions are mixed. Some, eyes wide with disbelief, look around, hoping the order is a mistake, that it is some cruel joke. Others stiffen, their backs straightening in the wake of humiliation and fear. The Japanese women, trained to resist at all costs, know that defying an order would mean immediate punishment. But this command seems different. It's not a military order. They are not soldiers in a combat zone anymore. They are prisoners, stripped of the power and dignity that they once held. The dichotomy of their past and present roles crashes down on them in an instant. For the American soldiers, the situation is equally uncomfortable. Many are appalled by the order they have just received. Some are seasoned veterans of the Pacific War, used to the cruelty of battle and the harsh realities of the front lines, but nothing could have prepared them for the moral and emotional conflict they now face. These women are not combatants in the traditional sense. They are medical personnel, factory workers, and support staff, caught up in a war they never wanted. To them, the women before them are no different from the nurses and civilians they themselves have been trained to protect. The tension in the air thickens as the soldiers, visibly shaken, stand in silence, unsure of what to do. One of the women, a nurse named Yumi, looks around at the other prisoners. She can see the fear in their eyes, the confusion and pain that flashes across their faces. Yumi had been a nurse in a military hospital in Japan before the war reached her shores. She had been trained to care for the wounded, to administer medicine, and to offer comfort in the midst of suffering. She had never expected to be caught in the very machinery of war she had spent her life tending to. Now, standing in a foreign prison camp, the stark reality of her situation crashes down upon her. The command to undress feels like the final, soul-crushing insult in a long line of betrayals and violations. As the soldiers hesitate, unsure how to proceed, one of the senior officers steps forward. He had been at the front lines for much of the war, hardened by years of combat, and yet even he is repulsed by the order he is about to enforce. His voice cracks as he gives the command a second time. The women, stripped of their dignity and autonomy, look away from one another. In their silence, there is an overwhelming understanding that this moment, this degradation, is a direct consequence of the war. They are not fighting for anything anymore. They are simply fighting to survive. But just as the women begin to comply, a twist of fate changes the course of events. As they begin to undress, a new order comes through, one that immediately halts the process. The commanding officer, suddenly filled with a rush of remorse, steps forward and orders that the women be clothed once more. The soldiers, watching in disbelief, begin to help the women put their clothes back on, the weight of what had just transpired heavy in the air. the confusion on both sides is palpable. For the prisoners, the brief moment of humiliation is a reminder of the powerlessness they now face. For the soldiers, it is a moment of moral reckoning, an opportunity to question the true nature of their role in this war. The women, once proud and fiercely independent, are left to navigate the complexities of their new reality as prisoners of war in a land they do not know. With no certainty about their future, the story of these women and the shocking twist of their treatment would remain a pivotal chapter in the larger narrative of the Pacific War. It would serve as a stark reminder of the moral compromises that war often forces upon those involved. The moment of humiliation, followed by the sudden reversal, speaks to the deep psychological and ethical tension faced by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. For the American soldiers, the event was a painful reminder that war is not only fought on the battlefield, but within the hearts and minds of those who fight it. It was a moment that would shape their understanding of humanity, honor, and the price of war. For the Japanese women, it was an experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, an experience that would forever challenge their understanding of power, dignity, and survival as the war dragged on. These women would remain prisoners in the hands of their captors, caught in a strange, liminal space between soldier and civilian. But the shocking twist of this moment, their forced undressing and the abrupt reversal, would forever be etched into the annals of history as a microcosm of the greater, tragic conflict that consumed the Pacific during World War II. And, for those who bore witness to it, it would remain a painful reminder of the humanity lost, and sometimes regained, in the flames of war as the months passed. The Japanese women held in the American POW camps faced the harsh realities of their captivity. Many had witnessed the atrocities of the war firsthand, and for them, the reversal of the undressing order was not so much a moment of reprieve, but rather a lingering reminder of the trauma they had endured. The brutality of the Pacific theater had stripped them of their humanity in more ways than one. But this unexpected moment of mercy, however brief, provided a new lens through which to view the moral complexities of the conflict that had defined their lives. The story of the women in the POW camps did not end with that shocking moment. Instead, it was part of a broader narrative of survival, suffering, and, ultimately, reconciliation. For the American soldiers, particularly those who had participated in the moment of degradation, the memory of the event would weigh heavily on them. Many would later recall how they had stood frozen, unsure of how to process the orders they had been given. Some would even express a deep sense of guilt, feeling they had crossed an unspoken line of decency. The commander who had issued the order, his voice shaking as he revoked it, would later reflect on the decision with remorse. In the heat of war, it was easy to lose sight of the values that separated soldiers from the barbarity of the enemy. But in that moment, as the women were being ordered to undress and then clothed again, the commander realized that he, too, had become part of the machinery of humiliation that defined the war. War had, in many ways, consumed him and his soldiers, stripping them of the compassion that had once been central to their humanity. The prisoners, for their part, began to come to terms with their captivity in more subtle ways. As the days wore on, some of the Japanese women began to form bonds with the American soldiers and nurses, exchanging words in broken English, learning about their captors' lives, and, in turn, sharing their own experiences. One prisoner, named Emiko, a former teacher in Japan, began to teach the American soldiers Japanese words, offering them a glimpse into the culture and traditions that they had once been told to despise. In this small exchange, Emiko found an unexpected sense of connection, one that transcended the brutalities of the war. The American soldiers, hardened by their experiences in the Pacific, began to see these women not as enemy combatants, but as fellow human beings, individuals who had been swept up in a war that had taken everything from them. For the first time, the concept of enemy seemed less defined by nationality or uniform and more by the shared suffering that the war had inflicted on everyone involved. The connections formed in the prison camp, though brief, spoke to the possibility of healing, even in the aftermath of the greatest global conflict the world had ever seen. But as the war came to an end, the women's future remained uncertain. The Americans, following the general practice of war prisoners, would begin to repatriate those who were captured. However, the German and Japanese prisoners often faced harsh psychological reintegration into their own societies. Many had endured years of torment in the war camps, and even more had lost their sense of self-identity. Returning home was not the end of the trauma, but the beginning of another long struggle. For the American soldiers, the emotional toll was also heavy. They had fought a brutal war in the Pacific, and their eyes had seen horrors beyond comprehension. But the moment of mercy in the POW camp served as a powerful reminder that compassion could survive even in the most harrowing circumstances. As soldiers, they were part of the larger machinery of war, but in those quiet moments, when they had to decide between cruelty and kindness, they remembered the humanity they had sworn to protect. After the war, those Japanese women who had survived would have to reckon with their roles in the war effort, both as soldiers and as civilians caught in the crossfire of a brutal conflict. The trauma they experienced in captivity and the harshness of their forced participation in the Imperial Japanese Army left deep scars that would never fully heal. However, for some, the kindness shown by the American soldiers would become a small but powerful moment of clarity, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of war, humanity could still find a way to break through. In Japan, many of the women who had been prisoners of war struggled to find their place in a society now grappling with the aftermath of its defeat. They faced not only physical scars but also deep emotional wounds, haunted by their experiences during the war and their treatment at the hands of their captors. Yet, for those who had been held in the American camps, there was also the profound realization that their treatment in captivity had been less about the animosity between nations and more about the cruelty inherent in war itself. The American soldiers, too, had been victims of the same conflict, fighting under the banner of their own nation but struggling with the same ethical dilemmas. For the American soldiers who had been involved in the incident, it marked a turning point in how they viewed the enemy. No longer faceless figures of hatred, the Japanese women became symbols of the unintended consequences of war, of the suffering inflicted on all involved, regardless of nationality. The memory of that moment of undressing, followed by the sudden reversal, stayed with them long after the war was over. It served as a stark reminder of the fragile line between soldier and civilian, between conqueror and captive, and of the moral choices that soldiers had to make, often in the heat of battle. Without fully understanding the consequences, both sides slowly rebuilt in the years following the war. The legacy of these prisoners, the Japanese women who had endured the brutalities of war and captivity, and the American soldiers who had carried out those orders, served as a quiet, painful reminder of the war's deep and lasting wounds. The stories of those who had endured the unimaginable, those who had been humiliated and then treated with compassion, became part of a larger narrative of reconciliation that would take decades to unfold. In the quiet aftermath of war, there would be no easy answers. The stories of those who had been prisoners would be told in hushed tones, in whispered recollections of suffering, survival, and the fleeting moments of humanity that persisted even in the darkest of times. For the soldiers, the prisoners, and the survivors, the lessons of war would never be fully understood, but the compassion shown in those fleeting moments would remain forever etched in their memories, a testament to the fact that, even in the most brutal of conflicts, there were still moments of grace and humanity that could not be taken away. The years following World War II brought a strange and unsettling peace. But for those who had lived through the brutalities of the Pacific conflict, the scars, both visible and invisible, would never fully heal. For the Japanese women who had been prisoners of war, the journey back to normalcy was marked by the heavy burden of trauma, guilt, and a deep sense of loss. Their time in American POW camps, particularly the shocking and humiliating moments they had endured, would follow them for the rest of their lives, shaping their identities in ways that were difficult to comprehend. In Japan, the post-war years were a time of reconstruction, not only of the country's physical infrastructure but also of its social fabric. For the women who had been captured, the war's aftermath brought an uneasy reckoning. They were part of a generation that had been taught to believe in the superiority of the Japanese Empire and in the righteousness of their cause. Yet, after the war, they had to grapple with the reality that their nation had been defeated, that the very ideology they had been raised to uphold had led to their country's ruin. They were not just prisoners of war. They were also citizens of a defeated nation, forced to confront the moral and emotional consequences of the war they had participated in. The war's aftermath left a generation of Japanese women, many of them former prisoners, in a state of emotional and psychological turmoil. They had been raised in a system that taught them to see the enemy as less than human, and yet, in the American camps, they had been treated with an unexpected measure of compassion. The dissonance between these two experiences was difficult to reconcile. How could they return to their lives in a country that had lost the war, a country that had committed atrocities, and yet had shown them kindness when they were at their most vulnerable? For many of these women, returning home was not a straightforward path. The psychological toll of the war and their captivity was profound, and many struggled to find their place in a post-war Japan. The trauma they had experienced in the camps was not something that could be easily spoken about, particularly in a society that was still grappling with the enormity of the war's consequences. They were expected to reintegrate into their communities, to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives and move forward. But the emotional scars they carried were deep, and for many, the memories of their time in captivity would remain with them forever. The American soldiers who had been involved in the incident, too, carried their own emotional baggage. The Pacific War had been brutal, and the moral compromises that had been made on both sides were difficult to ignore. The soldiers, who had been raised to believe in the righteousness of their cause, now found themselves questioning the ethics of their actions. The moment of humiliation they had witnessed, and the compassion they had shown in the aftermath, left them with a moral conflict that would haunt them for years to come. Many of them, like the women they had captured, would return home, but they would carry the weight of their experiences with them, struggling to reconcile the brutality of war with the humanity they had witnessed in the midst of it. The war, in many ways, had dehumanized both sides. It had taken away the innocence of soldiers and civilians alike, forcing them to make impossible choices in the face of unimaginable violence. But it was in the moments of mercy, however fleeting, that the true cost of war was revealed. In those brief moments when soldiers chose compassion over cruelty, when prisoners were treated with dignity instead of humiliation, a new understanding of the conflict emerged. The war had not only been a battle between nations, it had been a battle between the human capacity for cruelty and the potential for compassion. Even in the darkest of times, as the years turned into decades, the stories of those who had been involved in the war began to fade from public consciousness. The survivors, both prisoners and soldiers, moved on with their lives, many never fully addressing the psychological and emotional trauma they had endured. But the legacy of their experiences remained, quietly influencing the way the world viewed war and its consequences. The events in the POW camps, the humiliation followed by compassion, served as a reminder that even in the most brutal conflicts, there remained the potential for humanity to emerge. However briefly, the survivors of the Pacific War, both the Japanese women and the American soldiers, would continue to carry the memories of their experiences with them. For some, the story of their captivity and the moments of unexpected kindness they had received would serve as a painful reminder of the complexity of war, a war that had stripped them of their innocence, but also, in its own strange way, had shown them a flicker of humanity amidst the violence that in the end. The shocking twist that followed the order to undress, the reversal, the mercy, the compassion, would be a defining moment in the lives of those who had witnessed it. It was a moment that transcended the boundaries of national identity, of victor and vanquished. It was a moment that spoke to the deeper moral questions raised by war, questions that would continue to resonate long after the fighting stopped. And so, as the survivors of the war carried on with their lives, they would do so with the knowledge that, in the midst of the destruction and chaos, there had been moments of mercy, moments that could not be forgotten, moments that had changed the course of their lives forever. The legacy of the war was not only in the battles fought or the territories won or lost, but in the quiet, unexpected moments where humanity had triumphed over brutality, even if only for a fleeting moment.